May I please interrupt your conversations? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think this is as many people as we're going to get today. In the depths of the ocean, which surrounds the isles near the sun's rising place, was the dead body of a youth. Around him among the coral plants sat the golden-haired daughters of the sea, gazing on him through their beautiful blue eyes. They spoke softly in tones of music, and their words were taken up by the deep and borne by the waves to the shore, whence the breeze carried them to my spirit's hearing. Said the first one, "This is a human who came down yesterday when the sea was angry." And the second one said, "Nay, the sea was not angry, but this man, such are called those descended from the gods, was in a war which much blood was shed until the water became the colour of red. This human is a victim of that war." Said a third, "I know not what war means, but I know that man was not satisfied with his conquest of the dry land, but coveted the lordship of the oceans and invented strange machines to cleave the waters. Then Neptune, god of the seas, came to know, and he was angry because of this enmity. And man was made to appease our sovereign with sacrifices and offerings. That which we beheld yesterday descending was man's latest offering to mighty Neptune." A fourth one said, "How great is Neptune, but how hard is his heart. If I were mistress of the seas, I would not be pleased with bloody sacrifices. Come, let us look on this dead youth. Mayhap we learn something of humankind." Then the daughters of the sea drew near to the body and searched in the pockets of his garments. In the garment nearest his heart was a letter, which one of them took and read. "My darling, midnight has struck, and I keep vigil, sleepless, with no one to console me save my tears, and no body to comfort me but my hope in your return to me from the terrors of war. Well do I recall what you did tell me when we parted, that with every man are tears as a trust that must be returned one day. I know not, my love, what I write. Rather shall I let my soul flow on to the paper, a soul tormented by misery and consoled by love, which makes suffering a delight and grief of joy. When love made one our two hearts, and we awaited the union of two bodies within which was one spirit, war called you, and you followed it, impelled by duty to your country. Yet what thing is this duty that separates lovers and makes of women widows and of children orphans? What thing is this patriotism which for little causes calls to war to lay in ruins the land? What is this duty that fastens itself upon the wretched villages but is heeded not by the strong and privileged? If duty exiles peace from among nations and patriotism makes havoc of man's tranquility, then away with duty and patriotism. No, my darling, heed not my words, but be brave and a lover of your land. Do not hearken to the words of a woman whom love has blinded, whom separation has robbed of seeing. If love brings you not back to me in this life, then love will join me with you in the life to come. The sea maidens put back the letter beneath the youth's garment and swam away in silent grief. And when they were gone a distance, one of them said, "In truth, man's heart is harder than Neptune's." I've invited you all here today on the anniversary of the D-Day landing. In 1944, on the 6th of June, tomorrow, the greatest seaborne invasion in all history took place when the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy in the operation codenamed Operation Neptune. Over 1,000 ships and 1 million men were involved with the D-Day landing, some 300,000 of whom were landed on the first day. One of the ships involved with the D-Day landing was this ship here, HMS Isis. A few days after the D-Day landing, it was blown up and sunk either by a torpedo or a mine, we're not sure which. I don't know whether you've ever seen footage of a ship being blown up, blown out of the water. Well, it showed one of our ships, HMS Torrens, being blown up and sunk outside the heads a few years ago. I remember seeing this ship as a boy. The river-class destroyers that Australia had used to file up the harbour in procession as they went out to sea in a convoy for exercises outside. And when the Isis was sunk, there are, on the internet, I've found the accounts of 2 survivors who survived that sinking, and I'll just read out to you what they have said. Ken Davies said, "I came aboard Isis some 9 or 10 days before she was mined, and not only witnessed the bombarding of German shore positions, but also took part in the excitement of depth charging a suspected U-boat. I remember nothing of either event. It appears that the sights and sound of the mine explosion and its aftermath induced some sort of mental block. I nevertheless stand by my recollections of the mining itself and of my time on the Carly float and subsequent rescue by the American Coast Guard cutter. I was on deck when the ship hit the mine. Shortly after this explosion there was a second, which I assumed was that of the boiler. On both occasions I was thrown to the deck. On seeing the forward hatch falling away, I began to release one of the Carly floats. There must have been a dozen or more men just standing by the port rail, obviously in shock and doing nothing to help themselves. They only came to life when the float hit the water. Naturally, they were the first on. The emotional strain of our situation was soon demonstrated. On my raft, one young fellow's mind went. He kept talking to his mother while refusing to give up the paddle he was clutching. Another was wearing a duffel coat and a polar neck jumper. He was asked to give up his coat to cover a fellow who was wearing only a singlet and appeared to be badly scalded or burnt. Duffel coat refused. Someone suggested taking the coat off him, but wiser heads said that a struggle would have us all in the water, and if that happened, some would not make it back to the float. I remember the speed with which men died. The fellow next to me said he was feeling warm at last. This, I knew, was a sign of hypothermia. I tried to keep him awake by talking to him, but failed. It seemed no time at all before he was as stiff as a board and we tipped him over the side. Just as the sun was about to disappear, we saw the silhouette of 2 ships. They wouldn't have been much more than a mile away. Duffel-coat stood up to shout and wave. Whether he stumbled or was given a nudge, I don't know, but he ended up in the water. I don't know if he got back on board or not, but then I didn't look for him. It was at this time that a man I was told was the ship's RPC and I were fixing lifebelt lights onto a paddle. Eventually, the American Coast Guard cutter spotted us and nosed between our float and another, not realising that the two were roped together. This had the effect of turning our float onto its starboard side. We had to jump quickly across to the cutter. I was the second to jump, and I was terrified I would mistake my jump and end up in the water. In the event, all went well, and I was taken below and put in a bed with white sheets. John Parlane, as related by his daughter Frances. Dad had finished his watch and had gone below to lie on his bunk to rest. He had just been paid off for his tour of duty, which meant that when the ship went down, so did 2 years' pay. This kind of additional detail makes more tragic a dreadful tale. There was another man in the bunk below having his break too when the ship was hit by a torpedo. Dad was thrown upwards and banged his head on the ceiling, then thrown onto the floor. His head and leg were bleeding. There was a second hit, which literally opened up the ship where Dad was. In the wall of his cabin there was a great big hole where he could see the sea outside. He shouted for the other man to swim out with him, but the other guy declined the offer. Even though his roommate was uninjured, Dad never saw him again. Dad jumped for it and swam to one of the rafts which were filling up with survivors. There was no room for him to get on. With his head bleeding, he managed to twist the ropes which ran alongside the raft around his wrists to keep him attached to the float. He thought his head wound was his worst injury and didn't realise that he had a serious back injury, one that would keep him flat on his back for the next 3 months. He stayed all night in the water, watching men fall off the raft and dying. These men had no physical injuries. They had been suffering from exposure, hypothermia. Eventually there was space and Dad was able to get up on the raft. From there he was rescued the next morning. The rescue involved Dad being taken ashore strapped to a stretcher because of his back injury. In the hubbub of activity along the dockside, the rescuers thought my dad was an American because of his accent. He had been born in Gibraltar and lived in southern Spain for the early part of his life. He moved to North Wales as a teenager and learned to speak broken Welsh and English. It was with a strange accent that Dad managed to persuade a Red Cross padre that he was English and should not be loaded onto a plane bound for America with all the other American shell-shocked souls who were also strapped to stretchers. I remember him telling me that he actually held the padre by the collar and said he wouldn't let him go until he sorted out that Dad was who he said he was. The padre believed Dad and not only steered him in the right direction for medical care, but also let Dad write a few scribbled words on the back of an envelope. Mum was to be told in those early days that Dad was missing in action, presumed dead. What the War Office didn't know was that Mum had received a note addressed to her in Dad's shaky but inimitable hand, writing, saying, "Hurt my hand, write soon, Jack." Although it was some time before Mum heard anything else about Dad's welfare, she held on to the belief that he was alive somewhere. Dad was taken from the dockside to a military hospital in Yeovil where he was nursed back to health. He told me how he wished that the war was over for him at that point, but the Navy had other ideas, and when he was fit, he was sent to another ship. He had other accounts of all the ships he had served on during the Second World War. He said they were all minesweepers or mine layers. One day a request was sent around asking for volunteers to serve on a submarine. The Navy were getting desperate. Normally no one wanted to serve on a submarine because it was too dangerous. But because of the dangers faced by these men on mine layers and sweepers, Dad said every hand went up. He was not chosen. Many of the ships Dad served on during the war sank. You can imagine the teasing Dad had with a tale like that. But in reality, Dad suffered a great deal. After one sinking, he was sent home for 3 weeks' leave, and he told me he couldn't stop shaking for the whole time and was terrified of going back. But go back he did. I'm sure my account is not totally accurate. I hope it gives a taste of the difficulties which these men lived through and the bravery which cost them so dearly. I'm sure that more families than mine consider their loved one a hero too. There was another survivor from the ISIS named Whitson who came out to Australia after the war and found himself in a situation of mortal danger again. And it was again a group of Americans who came to the rescue. God bless America. The occasion, the group of Americans were led by Billy Graham, the evangelist Billy Graham, and the year was 1959, and the occasion was open-air crusades which were held at the Sydney Showground, which is now Moore Park Fox Studios. And there were so many people who came out to hear the Bible being taught on this particular occasion. The overflow had to be accommodated in Sydney Cricket Ground with a sound link up there. Whitson heard from Billy Graham that he was standing under God's judgment as a sinner, and heard the great news about God's rescue mission to planet Earth by sending Jesus to die for our sins. He trusted in that and became a Christian and was saved. Now at this point you might be thinking, well, Peter, look, this is all terribly interesting, this history, but this is, everything that you said so far is over 50 years since this has taken place. That's half a century ago. What's the relevance for us here and now? Fair comment. Duncan, would you please raise your hand? For those who haven't met him, I'm delighted to introduce former leading signalman Duncan Whitson, Royal Navy retired, late of His Majesty's ship Isis, now reporting for duty. Welcome aboard. Now, Amy and some of her friends are going to sing us a song.